And today we're very lucky to have with us Jessie Greengrass. And I'm going to introduce Jessie, and then we'll hear from Jessie read from some of her book, The High House. And then we'll have a little conversation here, and then you can join the conversation with any questions you may have. So thank you. Jessie Greengrass spent her childhood in London and Devon. She studied philosophy in Cambridge and now lives in Berwick-upon-Tweed, Northumberland, with her partner and her children. Her collection of short stories, An Account of the Decline of the Great Auk, According to the One Who Saw It, won the Edgar Prize and the Somerset Maugham Award. Her critically acclaimed debut novel, Sight, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. The High House, a novel about parenthood, sacrifice, love, and survival under the threat of extinction, is her most recent book. Please join me in welcoming Jessie Greengrass.
Thank you so much for having me here. It is amazing. So I'm gonna read and probably not explain too much because it is pretty self-explanatory. The novel is set as climate change slowly progresses, causing the world to kind of unravel, and it's set through that unraveling rather than after it. There are four main characters who kind of come together to form a family. There's Sally and her uncle, and Caro and her half-brother Paulie, and they end up in a remote house on the coast on the east coast of England, trying to survive after the flood, as it were. The two sections that I'm going to read, one of them that counterintuitive, you're going to read them in the wrong order, because the first one is set. The first section that I'm going to read, which comes later in the book, is set at the beginning of the timeline, and then I'm going to read the very beginning of the novel, which is set at the end. I left school for good at lunchtime on the day I turned 18. I walked home. The house was empty. I had no plans, either for the afternoon or for the time beyond it. My life, which stretched empty ahead, or didn't. It was becoming clear to everyone now that things were getting worse. The winter before, half of Gloucestershire had been flooded, and the waters, refusing to recede, had made a new fen, covering homes and fields, roads, schools, hills rising from it like islands. In York, the river had burst its banks and the city centre was gone, walls which had stood for nearly 2 millennia washed halfway down to Hull. People didn't say these places were gone. They didn't say that there were families living in caravans and service stations all along the M5, lined up in the car parks with volunteers running aid stations out of the garage forecourts. People said, they must have known their homes were vulnerable. We were protected by our houses and our educations and our high street shopping centres. We had the habit of luck and power and couldn't understand that they were not our right. We saw that the situation was bad elsewhere, but surely things would work out because didn't they always for us? We were paralysed, unable to plan either for a future in which all was well or one in which it wasn't. I'm not going back, I said to Father when he came home from work because the school had called to tell him I had left. What will you do instead, he asked, and I shrugged one shoulder up and slid my eyes away. There had been daffodils in the park at Christmas. The coast path had been redrawn at 6 different places over the last 3 years. I have to go and pick Paulie up from nursery, I said, unless you're going to do it. And I walked down the road to where Paulie was waiting, standing at the gate in his coat and hat and mittens. Your shoes are on the wrong feet, I said. No, they aren't. Oh, well, if you say so. What did you have for lunch? I can't remember. Strawberry sponge for pudding. Tasty. I love you, Paulie. I love you too. Can I watch a film when we get home? No. Pasta pesto for tea. He took my hand, and worry burned off like mist. And then this is the very, very beginning of the book. In the morning, I wake earlier than the others. I climb out of bed in my jumper and my socks, and I pull on my dressing gown, and after it, my leggings and my boots. I go downstairs, and it is cold and dark and very quiet. My boots are beginning to go at the heels now, but I am trying to get this last winter out of them. My jumper and my leggings are frayed at the cuffs, and my dressing gown is an old blanket with holes cut out for the arms, because dressing gowns are a thing that Francesca didn't think of. And although between the three of us we have a reasonable spread of skills, none of us can sew. In the kitchen, I check the fire in the range, put fresh wood on the embers and open up the vent until it burns. I pour the last of yesterday's well water into the kettle and set it to boil, put dried mint leaves in a mug, make tea. I would have had coffee once. I think this every morning. I think it, and then I think I can still catch the taste of it, but it's been so long it could be the taste of anything I am remembering. Milk, mustard, ham. They all bring the same flood of saliva into my mouth and the same sad twist into my chest. Yesterday it rained and I didn't do my coat up properly. Water got in at the collar and I spent the whole day damp, but today I can feel the chill of empty skies, and so I think it will be clear. Outside, beyond the window, past the orchard, the sky is still full dark, but soon it will start to pale. I open the doors a crack and the air is fresh and cold and it smells of salt. It will be an hour or more before the others are up. Caro sleeps badly and often goes into Paulie's room in the night to lie on the mattress he keeps for her on the floor beside his bed. When he wakes, he will stay still so as not to disturb her. It is his own kind of peace, he says, to lie warm under the blankets in the dark with nothing to do. We take these small luxuries where we can, especially in winter. You would think that with so much space, with the house and the garden, with the copse and the heath, the dunes and the beach and only ourselves, it would be easy to be alone, but we are a knot. We cling. Each of us knows at all times where the others are, in the same way that we always know what time it is, telling it from some combination of light and shadow and our bones, so that it is only now, when it's early, when Paulie and Caro are upstairs asleep or still, and things have not quite begun, that I can feel as though I am by myself. I step out through the doors into the garden, and around me silence spreads. I feel its emptiness. The air begins to lighten. Each breath hangs. I go down through the orchard, through the arch in the hedge, along the path and past the tide pool to where the river spreads, freed now of its cuts and embankments, its holdings and constraints to make its own slow way into the sea. Spring is coming. Its mnemonic is in the earth and in the branches, in the greening of the buds, the new spears poking among the dead reeds. And even while the cold still creeps into my clothes, I think of the warmth that will come to chase it soon. The grass is wet around my ankles. The air is still. From here I can see what is left of Grandy's cottage, and below it the half-gone pub, the village green. The rusting arc of the swing frame rises like a monument. Each year, between water and neglect, less and less of the village remains. Grass grows in tufts from walls. Silt covers gardens. Crabs run across the broken cobbles of the road. I listen to the pip-pip of the oyster catchers and a solitary curlew's call, and it seems strange to say it, but I am not unhappy. Dawn comes. I turn around and walk back the way that I have come, up the path, away from the river, towards the high house, which is my home. Thank you.
Wow. I'm going to try not to cry. People, yeah. That first passage that you read is, I think, that is one of my favorite parts of the book. And I think just that, that resonance of they must have known their homes were vulnerable. This can't happen to us. I just see, anyway, let me collect my thoughts.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Sure. Okay, thanks.
I can respond to that.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things that was really pivotal in writing this book was that feeling of thinking that there's time. Yeah. And I first sort of began writing it in 2018. So even in the time since I sort of started it, the world has kind of unraveled considerably. And I can remember thinking when I was writing it, like I was sort of looking back at my own childhood, and in the UK we have a kids program called News Round, which is like the news for children. And I was like watching that in the early 90s, and it was all Save the Whales and the ozone layer. We were so sure that we were going to fix it. And then you look behind you, and how have we got from there to here? Like, how has that happened? And the experience of that kind of that unraveling that's happened while we've just been trying to live our lives in the best way that we can, feels to me so kind of extraordinary and disconcerting, and I felt that was something that I really wanted to explore, and the ways that ties into, the feeling that somehow, no matter how bad things get, you'll probably be okay.
You're right. Well, I think I heard you describe it as sleepwalking into this. Yeah. You began, reading a section that was not that. Anyway, I just want to talk about the style, the form, the format, and how you move between time periods, and why you made that choice instead of writing it, more linear. Sorry.
No, it's a really good question. And prosaically, part of that is just because that sort of is how I write, and when I try not to write like that, it's just incredibly boring. As I've discovered in the last 2 years of trying to write a book that started at the beginning. But also, I think what interested me about this, and what interests me more broadly in writing, is in my own writing, or what I'm trying to kind of explore in my own writing, is the ways that people explain themselves, the ways that people explain their own lives. If you're telling a story, you don't start at the beginning. You kind of say, well, this happened. Oh, and hang on, that other thing happened, and that's why. You do that to try and explain to people, like a justification, often, what you've done and why you did it, and how it happened. And in the process of doing that, you can kind of often come to a greater understanding or a different understanding, and that fascinates me, and I think that is the main thing that I want to kind of explore with writing, and is the way that people do that.
I like that idea, novel as justification, almost. Your writing is so lyrical, and I think that everybody would agree that just on a sentence level, it is so moving. And Ryder was telling us before even though it's a short novel, you kind of take your time with it because it is so beautiful and so lyrical and poetic. And have you written poetry before?
No. Not since I was like 14. And that should go unspoken. No, but I am very... I think one of the things that I feel quite strongly is that we sort of set writing up as being these different things. There's poetry, and there's short stories, and there's novels, and actually I think that there's a much greater kind of shift, kind of interplay between those, and there's a kind of middle ground between them, and there's novels that are a bit like poems, and poems that are a bit like novels. There are novels that are essentially kind of constructed by layering short stories on top of one another. So I haven't written poetry, but I am very influenced by a lot of poetry, and particularly kind of rhythmically. I think that rhythm in writing is really important, and just the rhythm of a sentence and keeping that going, and understanding how you can kind of interrupt it, and the effects that you can generate. And that's all the stuff that poets, do with their eyes shut. And it's really good to kind of read that and to learn from it, I think.
Yeah. Well, speaking of going back to the beginning, starting a story, and going back to the beginning, let's go back to the beginning. And what was the germ or the seed, or what sort of inspired the High House? How did it begin for you? Was it a character? Was it a place? Was it a
No, it was overwhelmingly a kind of a feeling, I think. It was... And again, it has been, the landscape in which I was writing it is not the landscape that we are in now, I think, even though it's only been 5 years, or the landscape in which I began it. I looked around. I had 2 small children, and I looked around me at the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019, and was like, why is nobody talking about this? It's terrifying. And I wanted to find a way of writing about that, but specifically I wanted to find a way of exploring the way that it feels to live through something, rather than having a kind of apocalyptic novel where the world blows up, and then, which is what we had in the kind of 50s and 60s when it was all sort of nuclear fear. The differences between then and now, I think, are really interesting in that, with kind of nuclear terror, the idea was that there was a button and someone could press it or they could not press it. And the consequences of them pressing it were disastrous. But if they didn't press it, everything would just keep going as it was. So you could kind of, it's not to downplay the fear, but it's a very different fear, because this time, there's no button. It's a million actions, and a political system that arguably doesn't work, and globally. And how do you live through that, and how do you deal with it? And all of those were the things that preoccupied me. There's a novel by Neville Shute, which I read when I was about 14. My grandmother, I used to go and stay with my grandparents in East Anglia every summer. And my grandmother read blockbuster novels. So she'd have these shelves that would be like Geoffrey Archer, and then she had this whole shelf of Neville Shute, and there was one summer where I was reading Neville Shute, and it's all, romance between the wrens. And then I came to On the Beach, which is an absolutely kind of obliteratingly depressing novel. But I kind of read it and was like, God, I don't know what's happened to me. But it explores that territory, which is what's it like to live through a situation which you can't change. And it really had a very powerful effect. So I think I wanted to kind of return to that kind of idea.
Well, you did. It's interesting to hear you, talk about that nuclear war fear, because my parents are here, and I've gone to them, with my concerns about, climate change and the climate crisis, and just how do you keep going in this? And that is something that they point to, we lived under the threat of, total nuclear annihilation, but it does feel like a different threat.
Yeah, and I don't think that I think that it's not a race to the bottom. I don't think that it's valuable to compare the two, but I think it is valuable to compare them. I don't think it's valuable to say which one was kind of worse. They're just very different. But there was like 5 years in the middle where we thought we had it. I was 18 in the year 2000, and it was like, oh God, we fixed it. It's great. And then
we're going to have electric cars, and exactly. How has writing this book and the experience of it changed your relationship to the world around you, the land that you occupy? Can you tell us a little bit about Jessie? I think wins the prize for traveling the furthest to come to this island 30 miles out to sea in the middle of nowhere. You live almost near the Scottish border. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about where you are in the world, and maybe how your relationship to it has changed since writing this?
Yeah, I imagine that there's quite a lot of commonality. So we live in a small town in the middle of a lot of nowhere, by the sea, where it's very windy and very cold. And it's a lot colder than here. I think that I'm not sure whether writing the novel necessarily changed my... it's hard to unpick, because I was writing the novel as things were becoming kind of worse in the place that I lived. But there's a lot of grief. There's I used to go to the beach. We've got a lighthouse. You've got a lighthouse. We've got a lighthouse that's at the end of a breakwater, and the breakwater is half a mile. So you walk along the breakwater, and at the end of it, there's a lighthouse, and you're just in the middle of the sea, and you can see Holy Island, Lindisfarne on one side of you, and Scotland on the other side. And if you're lucky, there's dolphins, and it's lovely. And I'd go out there, and everything would feel better. And now I go out there, and it sort of does feel better, but also there's this kind of underlying kind of sadness. I see the seals bobbing about, and you think, well, what have we done to you, seals? The sea's getting warmer, and particularly, I've got no idea if this is something that you have that's kind of global, or if it's just us. But we've had an absolutely appalling bird flu crisis, and just 10, 20, 30 dead birds washing up with every tide. And it's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, to see that and to not be able to do anything about it. And those animals, that environment which has sustained us, which gives us hope, which which you have love for, to kind of be afraid that you've damaged it. it's very sad. Sorry.
No. I would say one of my questions is, how do you not get bogged down in sadness when thinking about the future and your writing? And
oh, because there's hope. As you know, there is hope there. There's people sitting in a room having these conversations now. You know, there's my children. There's other people's children determined that they will not do this. I think there is a swelling of kind of awareness and you know, that love that comes in all different forms, and from, you know, it's not just, you know, this type of person that is the kind of person that has environmental, you know, it's coming from everywhere now. And I think that you know, having that conversation, sharing that grief, saying, you know, it is a terrible and sad thing to be, you know, what are we going to do? I think that gives me hope.
yeah, and I think that is, when you get to the end of the High House, you know, there are many different ways to look at it. I think for me, when I, you know, finished reading, I thought, you know, all we're going to have is each other at the end of it, you know, and the communities we form, and the families that we keep together. And I just thought caretaking was such an important part of your book, you know, looking at the domestic and the day-to-day and the minutia of life that we all sort of fell into this rhythm of in the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think that kind of the domestic is so important, and it's often, you know, the domestic novel. It's you know, people talk about it very dismissively, but that's, I mean, what is there other than the domestic? That's where we live our lives, you know. We live our lives in you know, and unless you're like, you know, I don't know, so, not me. And so if that feels really important to me to explore, and you know, and I think that like community. So one of the things that I kind of did when I was researching the book was to read a lot about crofting, because I think that there's this sort of pervasive idea that if you could just build yourself a bunker, you know, you could go and live in it and everything would be fine. And if you look into crofting lifestyles, they are fundamentally social. Because even if your society is not very big, you can't do it all yourself. So there's a really beautiful book called Night Falls in Ardnamurchan, which is about the end of kind of crofting on the west coast of Scotland. And it's a man who was one of the last crofters, but he's sort of kind of almost a hobby crofter, so he'd gone to university and then he'd come back, but his father had been, you know, he'd lived his life as a crofter. And he talks a lot about, you know, having a barn. So you'd have a barn, and the roof would be falling off, and you'd have the skills to rebuild the barn. But the thing is, if you spend the time rebuilding the barn from scratch, which is really what it needs, you then don't have the time to do all the other things that you need to be doing. So you're not out, you know, tending the fields, and you're not picking cockles, and you're not, you know, all of these things which are the things that you need to do daily in order to have daily. And so what you end up doing is patching the barn, and you know, and going to your neighbour and saying, have you got I need a bit of wood, you know, 6 by 6. And they're like, yeah, but we haven't got any honey, you know, but you can't do it by yourself. You need those kind of relationships. They're really, really fundamental. And I found that fascinating. And that idea that love and care and community is what kind of roots us and grounds us and allows us to survive.
yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. On one edition of the High House, and it might be your UK edition. Yeah, it is. It says, "You think you have time, and then all at once you don't." And I think that's, you know, really just a big takeaway. And as I look at the clock and see it ticking down, I wonder, you know, what would you do with more time? You know, you're a mother, you're a writer, you're...
I'd sleep more. I don't know, but God, wouldn't it be good if we could just know what we know now and rewind 5 years, 10 years? It would, you know, it would feel then like we could do the thing, you know, we'd just have more time to implement the systems that we need to implement to make a difference. But somehow you're busy doing all the other things that are really important, and it's crofting again. You know, you can't just, like, if you've got kids or you've got friends or you've got people that you care for, or, you know, on whatever level, family, you can't just stop doing that to fix the world. You have to, everyone has to eat 3 times a day. You know, you've got to make the lunch. So, I mean, with more time, maybe you could do both. I don't know.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to take some questions. So I'm going to jump down there so I can gracefully jump down. All right.
I have 2 questions. The first one is on, it's crafting, crafting.
Oh no, crofting,
What is that?
CROF. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that was a thing. So crofting was so basically subsistence farming on the West Coast. So you would, but you weren't kind of, you would do a bit of fishing and a bit of foraging. You'd have peat for fires. You might have a cow, although that's complicated because obviously if you have a cow, you need that. I mean, again, you know, you need other people to have cows. You probably wouldn't, you'd grow oats, you'd collect shellfish, you know, and you'd do a little bit of all of those things. And that would be how you made your living.
Thank you. And the second question is, looking at your novel itself, I haven't read it, but about the characters in it, what part do they play? Because I know the environment you're describing is what we're doing in the world, or how the climate change is changing the world. But the book, as you wrote it, what are the characters like and what are they doing? How are they relating, or who are they?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, that's a good question. I should have explained that at the beginning. So the characters are a sister and her a girl and her half-brother. She's about 19 at the beginning of the book. And then also another girl who's about the same age and her grandfather. And as well as those characters, so one of the things that was really important to me when I was writing it is that I should be writing about people who are not culpable. So they were too young to have done and to have made any difference, but they are the ones that have inherited the problems. The girl and her half-brother, so one of the characters from the very beginning of the book is her stepmother, Francesca, who is a climate activist who believes very strongly that she needs to fix things, and that kind of going out and doing that is her main role. But she also, without telling them, turns their holiday home on the coast into a sort of bunker. So it has a tide pool and it has a barn full of stores, but running through the novel is the idea that the fabric of the house won't last forever. The stores will run out. You know, it's a reprieve, but not a solution.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Jessie. As I said earlier, you have the most melodious, lyrical style of writing. It's just beautiful, with a social bend to it, which is miraculous that you can meld the two into such a good book. And I'm wondering what you're going to write next, which is a terrible question to ask.
No, it's a great question. Weirdly, I'm writing about an island. So I'm trying to, I think, one of the things is that my books tend to sort of feed into one another. So it's not like I kind of stop writing about something and then start writing about something else. It's been difficult to write after this book because it's like, what are you going to write about other than the climate? But then also, I don't have anything more that I feel that I can add to that. So I am writing a book about a tidal island, loosely based on Lindisfarne, which is off the northeast coast of England, that has a causeway that opens for half the day. And it's about the history of the island, the way that kind of, and also the way that people use it and view it, see it as an escape. You know, they think that all their problems will be solved if only they can, you know, go and live in this beautiful, you know, and then find that actually they are still themselves. So there's lots of things. Sorry,
Somebody over here just said, "What else is new?" It is our life, Jessie.
Well, And I guess that, it is sort of a way of looking at kind of contemporary, the UK and our relationship to our history, because we are also an island, and we're quite sort of, like at times, currently, quite isolationist. And yeah, I could do without that, but so it's sort of a way of exploring that.
Thanks for asking. Oh, great. On my way.
Thank you. Yes, you spoke about being hopeful for the future and how when you started the book, it was kind of sad topic, and the future going on, we're getting more educated. This summer, I also read another book called The Light Pirate, which has a very similar theme to yours. So I guess my question is, how do you see the role of authors and literature going forward to help these causes that are, so in need of help?
That's a really good question. And I think that it's different whether you're talking about fiction or non-fiction. And I think that they have very complementary roles. So I think that kind of very well researched, I can't do that, non-fiction is an extraordinary resource, particularly if it's written in an approachable way. But I think that what fiction can do that is so important, and it's one of the reasons that we care about it, and it's one of the reasons that it's so powerful, is that it doesn't have to give you an answer. It doesn't have to tell you what you should feel or what you should do. It can say, you can explore territory. You can say, I feel this, but also this. It can be complicated. It doesn't have to resolve. And I think that allowing ourselves to have that space to explore how we feel about being alive in the world, how we feel about what should happen, which is not going to be the same for everybody. The answers to all of this. I think it can just let you map that territory. And the more novels that there are, the more different ways of mapping there are. And I think that that's really important. And and I think that it enables people to kind of recognize themselves, and it enables you to kind of put words to feelings and to then talk about them. And I think that unless we do that, we can't expect to change things. So I think it is vital.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have time for a few more questions if anybody has any more. Oh, Molly, great.
Thanks, Mary. One thing that I was wondering after reading the book and then learning that you studied philosophy, I feel like with climate change kind of becoming more and more immediate in front of us, it's this call almost to live into our values in a way that we maybe haven't in the past. And I'm just wondering how your study of philosophy has influenced the way that you view climate change challenges in front of us.
So I think that my study of philosophy sort of influenced everything that I think and do, but I should probably clarify that I did the end of philosophy that is so unrelated to the real world that it basically doesn't connect anymore. So I kind of studied the philosophy of language, and rather than any kind of ethical or moral philosophy, which I found just I was like, oh, that's not an answer. It's just all really hard. But I think that probably, I think that it's important to engage with those questions in whatever form you want to. I'm interested in what you said about kind of leaning into our values, and I do think that that's true. But I think that also there's one of the things that's really difficult about being alive at the moment is feeling the difference between individual responsibility and collective / governmental responsibility. And I think that the two just keep kind of, obviously, I don't know, I can only speak for my own tiny and rubbish country, but there is a real tendency for the government to pass off the responsibility onto the individual, and then to not give you any money, so you can't deal with it. So I think it's important to realize the limits of individual responsibility. Like, we do have a responsibility, but also it can be absolutely paralyzing to be standing in the supermarket and thinking, hang on, I can't buy cow's milk because cow's milk is bad, but I can't buy almond milk because I've read that that's bad, and now everyone's growing oats because everybody wants oat milk because I heard that that was good, and now the oat, and it's just so overwhelming. And I think it's important at moments like that to step back and say, who should be taking the greater chunk of responsibility in changing these systems. Sorry, I went really off-piste on your question.
It's great.
Great. I have a question about Francesca, because when you're reading the book at the beginning, she seems kind of like an absentee mother. She's traveling all over. She's kind of not being with her children a lot. Then she takes her husband with her. And in the end, you realize that what she was doing was really being the best mother, because she's really setting up her children, to survive. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you ever thought about explaining Francesca in a little better, more wholesome. Like, why didn't she ever kind of explain to her children what she was doing, or was that too scary for them?
Yeah, I think she's a difficult... I wanted her to be a difficult character. Fun fact, initially she was a man. But when she was a man, it was just like, oh yeah, he's gone away. he's gone to work. So as soon as I changed her to make her a female character, to make her a mother, she becomes so much more morally complicated for exactly that reason. I think that she doesn't explain things because she doesn't necessarily know. There's still this idea of hope and whether you want to burden your children. She kind of, she's a difficult woman, I think, is the sort of idea. But I also I wanted to get at the idea of what would you do if you really truly believed, and you were the only person that could see it, that the world was coming to an end, and you thought that you could do something, maybe, but also you had a family. You had a family, and I think that she does what she feels is right, which is to go and use her expertise to try and avert this crisis, but also because she can't really completely commit to that, she builds this bunker. I think that there's also, I wanted to explore ideas in the novel of who gets to survive and, who gets to be the last one out, really, I think was a big thread that runs through it.
Well, I'm glad we got back to Francesca, because I loved Francesca, even though I knew she was supposed to be unlikable. And I was talking to Jessie beforehand because there's something happens to Francesca on the East Coast of the United States, and Jessie had never been to the United States until right now. So I wanted to know if you could tell us why you set that really catastrophic moment in the East Coast.
Francesca does not give very much away because it happens pretty early in the book. Francesca is probably killed in a hurricane in a place that is not specifically said to be, but basically is Miami. And I wanted it to be somewhere that was far away from me, but importantly, somewhere that was both wealthy and vulnerable. And so it is, the event that happens is so catastrophic because it happens to people who are recognizably us, and I had to find a place that had that kind of intersection between wealth and low-lying coastal climate. So that was why.
I think we had one more question.
Could you cite some specific sources of your remaining hope for our future? I feel as if, maybe you've recognized that there are some things that are being accomplished. What would those be? Could you cite maybe 3?
In terms of concrete policies, I think Not very. I mean, not very easily, I suppose, because I think that the kind of hope that is to do with systemic change is slow coming, but a lot of the hope that I do find I get from the people that I talk to. I'm trying to think of kind of. I mean, obviously, I'm also very UK-centric, so I'm trying to think of anything that we've done in the last 5 years. But unfortunately, well, I do. You know, I think again, like it feels like the anger is growing, and that is going to force change. So we currently have a government in the UK that doesn't really value or care about the future, really, and I think that's going to change, and that gives me a lot of hope. And I think that the conversation is shifting, and that gives me a lot of hope. So I think that even in the time since I wrote this book, I've had less, well, I don't think this is really going on, and more, you know, more kind of variation in what people think we should do about it. I think that there are fewer and fewer people who think that that this is not a real thing. And that gives me a huge amount of hope, because that's been such a barrier. You know, the idea that you can just say, well, you know, it's cyclical or whatever. You know, London was 40 degrees last summer. It's never been like that. I went down for the weekend and it was devastated. Everything was dead. And I think that people are seeing that, and that change is slowly coming.